Do you know that most fears that we have are learned? In fact, one could argue that nearly every fear we have is something that we learn in our life. There are very few actual fears that we need to have for self-preservation. Any phobia that you may have, a fear, an intense, irrational, disproportionate fear to any given situation or environment or object, that is something you learn through your life. If you have a fear of other people's judgment or a fear of failure, that is also learned. If you have anxiety or stress because you're putting too much pressure on yourself, that's also learned. So the question is, if virtually all the fears that we experience and all the fears that really stop us from being truly fulfilled and congruent and achieving our greatest life, if those fears are learned, how did we learn them? Well, there's a few different ways that we learn fears. Like anything else, it can be learned through direct experience, something that you experience firsthand. And an example here would be if you were attacked by a dog as a child and you happen to develop a fear of dogs, which certainly does not always happen in that scenario, but if it did, then you learned to fear dogs because of that attack. If you were in an airplane that almost crashed, or more accurately, it probably just had a lot of turbulence and it seemed very scary, you may have learned to be afraid of being in an airplane because of that experience. So that's direct experience. Another one, which is related, is by witnessing something. This could be witnessing it right in front of you. I had a client once who witnessed her father freaking out on an airplane because he had a fear of flying, and she was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, and she developed a fear of flying from that. Before that, she didn't have a problem with turbulence, but watching a grown man who is supposed to be stable and balanced, to see him lose it, basically taught her, without realizing it at the time, that being in an airplane is scary and dangerous, and so she developed a fear of flying from that point forward. I also had a client who had a fear of lizards. Now, she had never been attacked by a lizard. In fact, very few, if any, people have ever been attacked by lizards, since they're one of the most innocuous and harmless animals unless they're provoked and they're large. Only one type of lizard is actually poisonous, and so the reality is, if someone has a fear of lizards, they had to have learned it. Usually it's through someone else who had that fear, and it's just passed on. So this client I had who had the fear of lizards remembered that when she was 5 or 6, her mother freaked out because a lizard fell out of a tree and landed in her hair. So she previously didn't have any fear of lizard. Her mother did. She saw her mom get upset, and then she became afraid. That's doing it by witnessing. So one is direct experience. The other is a form of direct experience, but it's watching someone else experience it. Another way we learn fear is by actually being taught to be afraid. Now, a common situation here that I've seen with many of my clients is that as a child or a teenager, they were constantly warned by their parent that there are dangerous people out there and you need to come home before dark because someone might abduct you, or you could get hurt, or something awful will happen. So they've been effectively brainwashed into believing that something bad is going to happen, and so as a result, to protect themselves, their subconscious created fear. Now, sometimes this can turn into ongoing anxiety later in life, even if there's no real direct threat. But that's learned by being taught to be afraid. And this sometimes happens when people who are racist become very prejudiced of a certain skin color or certain ethnicities because they have been taught by other people who were racist or were paranoid and prejudiced, and so they just learned it as normal. It doesn't mean it's their fault. It's not about fault. It's about how did we learn it. And in addition, there's another way, and that is by just almost accidentally, not through being taught, not through experience, but through a change in the way we believe or think about something. I've had many clients over the years who developed a fear of flying when they had a baby. And as soon as they had a child, suddenly their mortality had a greater consequence than it would when they were just married. It's kind of strange, but suddenly it seemed like their life or their death would be a more significant impact on their loved ones to leave a child alone. It's okay to die on the spouse, apparently, but not on their children. But this is not a logical issue anyway. This is, irrational nonetheless, like all fears. So they developed a fear of dying in a plane crash, even though they had never been in a bad flight or a turbulent flight. Now, in all these cases, whenever we learn to be afraid, an important concept that is critical to resolving their issue is that you can unlearn it. If you learn to be afraid, you can unlearn it. And in fact, really, every experience, every client I've had something that they learned. Smokers learn to smoke, usually when they're teenagers. People who like hard alcohol have to learn to acquire that taste. No one's born enjoying whiskey. Someone who overeats or has a proclivity towards junk food has to learn that. And even people who are addicts in some way have to learn through their own experience to be addicted. So in all issues, whether it's a fear of public speaking or a fear of judgment, it's our direct experience, our witnessing someone else, our being taught to be afraid or to have that disempowered belief and that behavior. And the other one is just a somehow almost accidental change in your underlying thought pattern that creates fear. In all of these cases, all these behaviors, all these emotional hang-ups that people have been learned at some point. Anything you have learned can be unlearned. So remember, when you think about using hypnosis, it's really just a methodology to make the learning process easier, to unlearn that which you've learned that's stopping you from feeling fulfilled and healthy and inspired and empowered in your life. So that's how we learn fear. And what I've seen over the years is my work as a hypnotist is that's the best way, the most efficient way, the easiest way to unlearn those fears. Keep that in mind and realize that whatever you've learned that's stopping you, you can unlearn it or relearn it to be free once again.